My strongest memory was just a day my dad spent with me. And I think as dads, we don't realize the impact of simply spending times with our children. Anyone who's willing to come and hear about Jesus gets to come. And that's how it works. It just seemed all the more affirming to say, Diane, your job's done. You've done what you needed to do for your brother. And it's time to come home.
Good afternoon and welcome again to another Legacy Men's podcast at the Depot at Cornerstone Church. My name is Gary Trevor, your host, and Jason Gonzalez is my co-host. Welcome.
Thank you very much for tuning in here at the Legacy Men's podcast, where we learn how to live and leave a godly legacy. We're extremely excited. Thank you so much for subscribing, checking us out there on Spotify. We're excited to have Pastor Linn with us. Will you introduce us to our guest today, Gary?
We will. We have Pastor Linn Winters, our senior pastor, creator and founder of Cornerstone Church. Pastor, thank you for giving us opportunity.
Yeah,
he is married for 44 years.
42.
42, excuse me. 42, younger.
Yep.
Has one wonderful son, Josh, and I believe you have 2 grandchildren.
Depends on how you count.
All right, tell me then.
So we have an adopted daughter from Kenya who has 2 children, and then we have her ex-husband, who was also a boy from the orphanage, who considers us mom and dad. So and then he has another child. So total, I have 5 grandchildren.
Awesome,
Okay.
even better.
And I have 3 children. So yeah.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
So let me start and ask you a question. Tell us about your parents and their families.
Yeah, so really just a crazy contrast between those 2 families. My grandfather on my mother's side was a Baptist pastor. So my mom grew up in church her entire life and was that pastor's daughter and all that goes along with that. My dad grew up in a home of just absolute chaos. He did become a Christian, and so did my grandmother and my grandfather on that side later in life. And so then my parents met. But when my parents met, my dad was still the rebel guy. And so my grandfather, the pastor, really was against the marriage in the first place. And my mom loved the guy, and they got married. So that was kind of the beginnings.
Okay. And then walk us through this, like the rebellion and just kind of like the chaos that he went through. What were some of the things that you heard about that?
Yeah,
were part of that
so
brokenness?
it's interesting. On my dad's side of the family, where a lot of the chaos had happened, their modus operandi, so to speak, was to keep it all quiet. You never talked about that stuff. So it was years later that I began to understand what my dad's backstory was. And basically, his grandmother, my great-grandmother, was probably a prostitute. She was married to 3 different men along the way. And my best memory of her is her cussing me out like a truck driver for not eating my corn. So she was a tough lady. She really, really was. She had 2 daughters. One was my grandmother, Thelma, and then she had another daughter. And that one, Helen, was actually married and divorced 13 times. There's 2 other men in the story. We just can't find marriage certificates. And if you think about it, this is happening in the 40s. So you can imagine, today it would be unheard of if someone was married and divorced there. But in the 40s, you get a pretty good idea what her lifestyle was like. Yes. My grandmother was married and divorced 3 times. And in her younger years as an adult, she had this incredible need for some sort of affirmation from a man. And so she spent all of those years just chasing men. And she would literally hop in a car with a man and they would just go driving all over the country. The problem was she had 2 boys. She had my dad and she had his older brother named Linn. And she would drop them off at orphanages. She would drop them off at relatives' houses and then take off with other men she happened to be with at the time. And it wasn't until someone would give her a call and say, hey, you need to come pick up your boys. And she would drive back, she'd pick up her boy, and she'd just take them somewhere else and drop them off again. And so that was my dad's upbringing in childhood. And so it caused him to have huge relationship type issues within his life because he really did not have a mother. He was, for all intents and purposes, an orphan who was just being replaced, in all sorts of places.
Yeah, and
So you can imagine when he married my mom, he didn't come in with the skills and the abilities to be a husband or to be a father. He just
and he had a traumatic experience growing up as well. That brother, he ended up losing that
Yeah,
brother
so
too, correct?
they were actually at an orphanage, and my grandmother had dropped them off there. And they went in at lunchtime. They'd been swimming in the morning, and somebody said, "Where's Linn, my dad's older brother?" And everybody said, "We haven't seen him." And so they went back out to the swimming area, and Linn was at the bottom of the pool.
Yeah.
And and then that's how I got my name. He named me after his older brother who died, which to me is a little bit interesting that he'd have to say my name all the time, and it had to remind him
Right.
of his brother, but he did, and so that's how I got my name.
Yeah, and this was impactful because for listeners, I mean, we're talking about carrying on the family name and the legacy of just it comes with the brokenness side of things too, right? But we'll talk a little bit later on how you were able to break that chain and some of that brokenness and really focus on the next generation, what you wanted to do with your legacy. So, Gary.
Tell us about, you had siblings, sisters.
Yeah.
One very specific one that you attach yourself to.
Sure, absolutely. So I was the oldest of four. I had three younger sisters. My youngest sister, Diane, was severely autistic, and I say that because it's not what you see on TV where these people have what I would term more mild autism, and then they have some unbelievable skill or talent that goes along. My baby sister didn't have any. She probably never progressed beyond being about a 4-year-old. And with that came all sorts of challenges. She had to be watched every single moment, or she would do things to get attention. She'd turn over furniture. She would go into the kitchen and put a plate in the sink and then turn the water in. She'd turn on the stove and put her hand on it. Just anything. She didn't care if it was positive or negative. She just wanted constant attention. For me, I look back at this moment, and I'll be honest, as a young boy, I kind of resented God for my sister. I'm like, hey, why would you give us a little girl like this who has so many challenges and just constant need within our family, right? Yeah. And by this time, Dad had already taken off, so it's Mom and us 4 kids trying to do life alone.
This is at age 9.
Yeah, 9. Dad had multiple affairs, and finally, Mom had discovered this one, and they ended up separating. He went his way, and when he went, he went. He had almost nominal contact with us as a family. So Mom and us 4 kids went into survival mode. We were literally just hand to mouth trying to live. And then, of course, you've got this special needs little girl in the home on top of all that.
Yeah, Gary and I were really curious about something because God shows up in these moments where, you share some of this with the church, which I get the chills because it's just, even my wife, we hear this story and time again, you were like, it's the first time that you saw the church being the church.
Yeah.
How old were you and what happened?
So I'm probably about 12, and we had dropped out of church because with my baby sister, and you got to remember, this is back, no one had special needs programs. Nope. And so you couldn't take her into the service. She would have been disruptive in the service. And so we were out of church. And there was a little EV free church that was about 3 blocks from our house. And I had gone to a couple things they'd had for young people. And there were 2 ladies at that church who came and knocked on our door one day and said, "We're going to take turns watching Diane so that your family can go to church." And you got to remember, this is also back before multiple services. So there was one service. So those ladies' commitment was they were going to miss church half the time so that my family could go to church all the time.
Wow.
And it really was. It was the first moment I saw the church behave like the church. And it was a profound moment in my life that, because like I said, up until then, we felt like we were on our own, right? And here were Christians that were leaning in to us.
Yeah, and this was at the age of 12, you said?
Yeah, about 12.
Right? Yeah, and I think, Gary, you were going to ask about when he accepted Christ.
Basically tell us, because I always ask this question, so at what age did you receive Christ? And then tell us about, which was so interesting, at age 9, your dad obviously divorced your mom.
Sure.
And you only saw your dad 3 times a year.
Yeah.
Kind of walk us through that, because that to me just sounds Very challenging.
It was. It was definitely was. So I actually became a Christian at 6. So at that point, we'd been going to my grandfather's church, and I'd been in Sunday school classes as a kid, and they had explained, that you ask Jesus to come into your heart and forgive you your sin.
Right.
Interesting enough, I didn't do it, like in the classroom with an adult helping. I literally went home, and I was sitting on my top bunk bed, and I thought, you know what? I need to be a Christian. So I bowed my head right there, and I asked Jesus to forgive my sins and to come into my heart. I slid down off the bed. I walked into the kitchen to my mom, and I said, I need to be baptized. And she says, why do you need to be baptized? I said, because I just became a Christian.
Praise God.
So they had explained it to me that clearly, that at 6 I totally understood it.
Wow.
So then you fast forward, and my parents had moved from the Phoenix area, which is where my grandpa's church was, to Tempe.
Okay.
And I'm 9 at the time. That's when Dad's Affair comes out. And I remember for the first time hearing my dad and mom fight. So I'm sure they had disagreements before that, but they'd kept it from me.
Right.
But this was big, and so we're huddled down in a little room on the side, and we're hearing Mom and Dad go back and forth. And then I remember Dad as he was packing up and getting ready to leave, and I met him in the front yard. And I said, Dad, if you love me, don't leave. And my dad didn't say a word to me, just turned and left, which for me was a statement, right? I felt I had heard real loud and clear where I stood. And then, if that wasn't enough, he literally, he went into sin. I mean, he just did everything you can possibly, I mean, if you've got a list, my dad checked every
All the
box on the
boxes.
list just about. And as he was doing that, he had no room for us as kids. He just didn't. So we were required to go to see him on his birthday and on Father's Day and on Christmas. Those were the 3 times we had to see him. And because of the lifestyle he was living, every time we went to his house, there was a different woman. He was burning through women like crazy.
Yeah.
And you could tell they thought they were the one. And us kids would ride home kind of snickering, going, it'll be someone new at Christmas.
Yeah.
They're not the one. Yeah.
Really big learning experience for listeners here. You called these moments that you went to go visit your father kind of the Inquisition.
Yeah.
Walk us through that, because
Yeah.
this is extremely important. Listeners, like, this is something that any parent will fall into this.
Yeah.
But it's important to just identify it and also understand that you can grow out of it.
Sure. No, so I think Dad thought this was parenting, but he literally would have us at the table, because we were usually having a meal at Christmas or the birthday. And he usually started with me because I was the oldest, and he would just start asking questions. Hey, how's school going? How's your car running? Just random questions. But the moment he heard, oh, I got a C in this, or hey, I didn't take care of my car, then he went into a tirade. He literally just spent the next 45 minutes to an hour telling whoever had not done the right, how irresponsible we were and how ungrateful we were and what a horrible child we were and how we were disappointing him. And it's kind of horrible to admit now, but I would go to those, Christmases or his birthday and hope that I got passed and that it was one of my sisters who got grilled that week. And I'm sure they, felt the same toward me. It's one of those things that I look back on and say, boy, I don't want to parent that way. It caused me to try to be more encouraging in my son's life and look for the things he did right that I could commend. And don't get me wrong, he did some things wrong and we had to talk about it, but I tried to live on the, hey, I'm going to applaud and I'm going to encourage the things that I see you doing in the right way, at least 2 to 1 for the things that I have to talk to you
What's
about.
so beautiful about that is that oftentimes we run from God because we were parented in that type of a structure, right? Is we always feel like God's trying to find what's broken in us as opposed to just loving on us and accepting us for
absolutely. And I think it affects us a lot, especially if we take that view of God, that God's always looking for what I'm doing wrong. Then he's a hard God to have a relationship with.
But there's one thing we want to drive on, which C.S. Men's always talks about: matching up to men of like-mindedness, iron sharpening iron. Tell us about your great experiences. I think it includes your uncle as well.
Yeah. So,
and the other mentors in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. So I look back now. I didn't realize, as a young boy, I don't realize what God is doing. But I look back now, and to me, it is just so crystal clear and obvious that God in his kindness brought multiple men into my life for seasons to be role models for me. And it was as simple as in grade school, there was a teacher who also went to that little EV Free church who just encouraged me, and I felt like I had a little bit of worth because there was a man who saw me not as a throwaway, right? And there was also another man in that church. They had a program that was called Christian Service Brigade, which was really a really bad church version of Cub Scouts. But he was also a biology teacher for junior high, and somewhere my heart just fixed on this guy. And all through junior high, when school got out, I would ride my bike in the wrong direction to get to his apartment. I'd have to sit outside for about 45 minutes till he got home from teaching school, and then I'd spend the whole afternoon and the early evening at his, just hanging out with a man that loved Jesus, right? And the part that shocks me is that he was willing to have me in his life day after day and let me eat his food and drink, all of his Coca-Cola, and then he would drive me home at the end of the night. I can't even tell you how thankful I am for him in my life. And then my uncle, who really wasn't living for the Lord that well at the time, but he took me under his wing. And the one thing I did see, I saw how he loved his wife, and I saw how he loved his kids.
Yeah.
And that became, again, a standard, a model in my life that I would do that same
And this
thing.
was you mowing lawns in Arizona.
Oh, yeah. So,
I mean, he was tough on you, too.
This will tell you the deep need of a boy to have a man in his life. So he would bring me over in the summer. I started when I was 9, right after my dad left.
Right.
He had a lawn mowing service, and we would mow anywhere from 11 to about 15 yards a day. And I would literally get behind that lawnmower and I would run because I wanted to be the best person on his crew. I wanted his approval, right? And I would do that all day long, all summer long, all the way up to 120, 121 temperature, right? And
For listeners that aren't from Arizona.
Yeah.
We're talking
it's real. It's a real
115
thing.
without the sun up.
And he paid me $2 a day. And I think later on he actually felt guilty about that. And I tried to tell him over and over again, Uncle Marty, don't ever feel guilty about that, because I got paid a lot more than $2 a day just being able to see you and how you treated your family. Right?
Yeah.
At 16 years old, I love that Gary mentions this about iron sharpening iron and mentors in your life, but there was a freeing moment. It was a marker moment that you had with the youth pastor. Walk us through that.
Yeah, so probably the fourth significant man that God brought in my early teen life was a youth pastor by the name of Wayne. And he literally would spend time with me. Youth group would be over, and he would take me to Coco's, and we'd have a cup of coffee, and I would just ask him about the Bible. I was just so ravenous and hungry about my Christian walk, and so I literally sucked the marrow out of his bones. I just asked him everything I could ask. And we were sitting in his car one night. He was dropping me off at the house, and he said to me, Lynn, you're just like your dad. And I said, no. I said, Wayne, I literally think to myself, what would my dad do? And I do the opposite.
Right.
And he said, Lynn, I'm not talking about your behavior, I'm talking about your heart. And he said, you're so consumed with being different than him that you're selfish and you're self-absorbed. And the only thing that matters to you is you. And it hit my heart. And he said, Lynn, the only way that you're ever going to be free of this is you got to forgive your dad. And I said, he doesn't deserve it. He's never asked it. He's never behaved differently. And Wayne explained to me and said, it's not about him deserving it. None of us deserved it, right? And it's about your heart being free, because as long as you hold the level of anger you do toward your dad right now, you'll always be focused on him. He'll be the marker of your life. Hence, I do everything different than my dad. Yeah. And he said, the only way you're going to be free of this is if you forgive him. And it was interesting that in that conversation, the other thing that hit me really, really hard was I realized for the first time that my dad didn't have friends. He was so broken from his childhood and having been raised. He didn't have friends. And so part of that freedom that happened that night for me too, not only was forgiving him, but realizing it wasn't me. He didn't have anyone he liked. He didn't have anyone that right? Yeah. So what felt such deep rejection of me, he didn't know how to have a relationship with me. And when I realized that, I went, oh, I'm okay. I'm
Yeah.
okay. It's my dad who has the struggle in his life.
God wants that burden lifted.
Yeah.
And it's so crazy how everybody's waiting to be first, right?
Yeah.
That person needs to be first and ask for forgiveness
Yeah.
for this because
And they need to admit how bad they were, and it seldom happens.
Yeah.
And the freeing, I love that word
Yeah.
that you use
Yeah.
because it's liberating,
Oh.
right? And what's even more for listeners is that individuals can see through this, right? Like when they see your heart and they know that your position was to be first and
Yeah.
to go seek forgiveness from somebody that didn't deserve it.
Yeah.
I mean, they know.
Yeah.
I can trust this person.
Yeah. Absolutely.
You know, and I've seen my father do that. As a matter of fact,
Wow.
my grandfather walked out on him when he was a young boy, and he carried that resentment for a very long period of
Yeah.
time. And when I heard the story of my dad finding him, just to go find him to seek that and have that forgiveness and actually have it right before he passed, it taught me so much more about grace.
Right.
Because I was like, if my dad can do that for a man that didn't show him love for such a long period of time, how can I not accept my Heavenly Father's grace?
Sure.
Right.
Absolutely.
And so just a beautiful thing. I appreciate
Yeah.
you sharing that. There's a beautiful memory that you also shared with us, which I think is important. With your father. What was your best memory with your father?
My best memory, at least, early childhood, was it was before the divorce, and he just took me out to the dump at Payson, and we shot his gun together. And so, as later years come on and my dad has left my life, in a way, I had this memory of the day my dad was with me. And literally, he ended up going on and being hyper successful, making a ton of money. And I went to him one day and I said, "Hey, Dad, I'm not worried about inheritance. I'm just not. And whatever you do with your money is what you do with your money. I want that gun. It's a memory that I've held close to my heart and have cherished the day we spent together." And he did. He ended up giving me the gun. I still have it on the deal.
That's awesome.
Yeah. But I think it's profound that my strongest memory was just a day my dad spent with me. And I think as dads, we don't realize the impact of simply spending times with our children, that you're carving deep, profound memories in their life, right? And we miss that so much, right?
We do.
We just
100%.
Yeah.
So, Pastor, talk us through at what point you went up to the front. I think you asked the pastor or a youth pastor about going to full-time ministry.
Oh.
He made some challenging comment to you about, "Are you serious?" And then walk us through that time. And then, of course, as we titled the topic today, "Changing My Legacy,"
Sure.
then you had spent some close. Then talk about Diane and how Diane impacted you emotionally, because you were somewhat respectfully stunted because of your father's influence,
Sure.
and how you had involved yourself in her life, and God had tended you so softly before you married Lisa.
Sure. So I was 15 years old. I was sitting in church. I don't remember at all what the pastor was speaking on. I'm sure it wasn't about being in ministry. And I actually remember that it went on for 3 weeks. For 3 weeks, I sat in that pew, because you had pews back in the day, and I wrestled. Man, God and I wrestled. And my heart, and I had already set my course. I was going to be a surgeon, and I felt God nudging me to be a pastor. And I didn't want to be a pastor because pastors are weird and they wear the wrong clothes and all that stuff. And so as I sat there, I said, "Hey, God, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll put verses up in my waiting room so people will know, and I'll put Christian things on the coffee table and stuff." And there was a moment in which, for me, it felt like God said, "Hey, Lynn, if you heal 100 bodies, it won't amount as much as if you lead one person to know Jesus."
Wow.
And I couldn't get past that if my life was really, really going to matter, that was the direction for me. So I walked forward. I walked up, because that's what you did back in those days too. And I said to the pastor, "Hey, I feel like I'm called to ministry." And he looked at me and just said, "Why?" And it wasn't why because he was trying to quiz me. It was why because you're the last person who ought to be in ministry. And I probably was at 15, right? And so, it was shocking to him and shocking to me too in that moment. And then I think you asked me about my little sister,
Your
Diane.
little sister, because that then brought you in because you'd spent time with her, because you and your mom invested time.
Sure.
But that impacted you because of the loss of the emotional support from your dad.
Yeah.
And then before you married Lisa, Diane had really softened your heart
Sure.
to make even a better dad. And talk about that
Yeah, I
legacy
think,
change
if
as
you
well.
think about it, here I am, a young man, and my dad's rejected me and all of that. And, the most natural thing is you get hard-hearted, right? You just go, hey, nobody else is going to hurt me that way. Nobody else is going to get that close in the deal. And I truly believe that the reason God placed Diane with such great need within our family, I think it was me. I think he knew he was going to call me to ministry. I think he knew that my heart was going to be hard along the way. And then he gave me this little sister that every time I walked into the house needed my attention, needed my care, needed my patience and my compassion. And I don't know that I would have ever even had those things if I hadn't had a sister who needed those things so desperately. And so I really believe she was God's gift to me to get me ready for ministry and to form in my life the things that I was missing so radically in my life. And it's interesting because Lisa and I got married, so now I'm out of the house, and my baby sister died just a few months later. And it just seemed all the more affirming to say, hey, Diane, your job is done. You've done what you needed to do for your brother. And it's time to come home and be okay.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And your mom was freed at that moment as well. I think from what you were saying, she was carrying that.
Yeah,
With
actually for my
family.
mom, it was a really, really tough moment.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where you and I look and say freed, and she felt like she'd lost her life. Because, when Dad and her first divorced, she's 30, I want to say she's 36 at the time, and you got to think back. This is 1960, 1970, and you just don't have divorce in the church.
No.
So here's this woman who's now divorced. She has 4 kids, the youngest of which is horribly special needs. And she thinks, well, how many 35-year-old men are still available? Because back in those days, everyone married at 19 and 20, right?
Yep.
So what 30-something-year-old man is still available for me who wants 4 kids, the youngest of which is autistic? And so she just said, that's not going to be my journey. I won't probably ever remarry. And so she devoted her life to raising Diane. Her big question was always, what happens to Diane after I'm gone, right? And so she saw that as her life's purpose. And so then when Diane is taken, she goes through huge trauma in her life because she just doesn't know what God had planned for her. She ended up raising 3 kids who all follow Jesus today.
Praise God.
They all have children who follow Jesus today.
Yeah.
Praise God.
And her great-grandchildren all follow Jesus today. So it's pretty easy on this side
Amen
to
to
see
that.
what her life purpose
Yeah.
was. But in that moment, it was heart-wrenching for her.
But there was one moment as well that you had mentioned that when your dad married Carol,
Yeah,
your mom had always thought he would come back and
Sure.
remarry your mom. And that kind of changed her as
that
well.
that was a tough moment again for my mom. So by this time I'm 16, Dad has chased who knows how many women. And we were over there, I think it was for his birthday, one of those 3 times. And as we sat down at the table, he turns to this gal who we had never met named Carol and says, hey, you need to know we're married. And this was stunning because we didn't think he was ever going to settle down and marry again. And in the middle of that dinner, my mom called. And the reason she called is because his parents had called her to tell her so she would hear it. And so she said, come on home. And so we came on home. And I can remember sitting on the couch with my mom, and she was just dazed. She was just dazed, and she's kind of staring blankly at the wall. And not even, I don't think, realizing she was saying it out loud. She said, well, I guess that's it. And it was the first time I realized my mom had been waiting for my dad to come home with all of his bad behavior. I wasn't. I was like, good riddance, right? But she had been waiting and praying and hoping that this man would get right with Jesus and that he would eventually come home to the family.
Yeah.
And she'd been waiting.
Pastor, we didn't touch on your mom a lot
Yeah.
in this one. I mean, this is Legacy Men's podcast.
Sure.
But there's so many beautiful women in our lives, and I love that you
Yeah.
kind of mentioned how much of the legacy she also had an impact on with,
Yep.
you and then your kids and the other your siblings and the grandchildren. All just such an amazing
Yeah.
woman of faith. And so we want to have you back at some point. We would love to talk about that as well.
Okay.
We wanted to talk about the church plant and kind of go back to your father, because he asked you a question that
that
also
was
is
very
a
good.
story that you've told that means a lot to
So,
men.
so my dad had stayed distant all through all of this time. And part of what you got to remember, he is a Christian. He's just not living like a
Right.
child of God, right? He's living as far away from God as he possibly can. And it's interesting because remember, he married Carol, and when he married Carol, he thought he was marrying the wildest woman out there. She had been at rock concert in this Woodstock. She'd been at Woodstock.
Oh, wow.
She was probably one of the gals. Yeah, you know what I mean. And she'd gotten off in Christian Science and crystals, and so he thought he was marrying this wonderfully wild, crazy woman. Ironically, they agreed to have a child. That was his agreement to her. He basically said, "I have 4. I don't need any more, but I'll give you 1." This little boy was born, and Carol felt the need for him to have something spiritual in his life. So she started taking him to an Awana program at a local church that was there. Part of the Awana program is they said, if your kid is in Awana, you have to be a part of it. You have to volunteer. So here's Carol, this wild woman, listening to Bible verses as the kids are all quoting them. And the women that were in that church began to talk to her about the Lord, and she becomes a Christian. Now she's dragging my dad to church. So think about it. I ran away from the pastor's daughter. I married the wildest woman I could find, and God, in his humor, had her find Jesus, and now she's dragging me back to church. And during that season, he sat there with his arms crossed, and he wasn't going to have any of it, but he did it to appease her. In the meantime, we're still estranged, and he doesn't have much to do in our lives. Matter of fact, I was serving in California in a church as a youth pastor. It was not uncommon for my dad to call me up on the phone and say, "Hey, Lynn, I'm driving past your town, and just wanted you to know." And I said, "Well, Dad, do you want to come have a cup of coffee?" "No." "Do you want to come to my house?" "No. I just wanted you to know I'm driving by," which was kind of like, well, thanks a lot. You're driving by, but you didn't care enough to come see me. I'm graduating seminary with my master's degree, and I'm getting ready to plant a church. And so my dad came to my graduation. So for the first time after 8 years, he was in my house for the first time for my graduation.
Wow.
And he said, "Lynn, hey, tell me about this church that you're planting." And so I told him a little bit about Cornerstone, and he said, "Can anyone come to that church?" And I said, "Well, Dad, yeah, anyone can come to the church." And he said, "Can I come to that church?" I mean, this is unthinkable right in that moment. And I said, "Dad, sure you can come to that church. You can." This actually created a crisis for the rest of my family because there'd been no healing. And so my mom and my sisters came and said, "Hey, if Dad's coming, we're not sure we can come." And I said, "Well, guys, you'll have to make up that on your own, because anyone who's willing to come and hear about Jesus gets to come."
Amen.
That's how it works.
Yeah.
So you're going to have to decide if you can sit in the same room. So that was the beginning of, and part of my joy and the part of my dad's story that everyone needs to know is that God did get a hold of my dad's life eventually. That while he was at the church that I planted, which is such a joy, he renewed his commitment to Christ and started chasing after God. And so the last quarter of my dad's life was wildly different than the first 3 quarters of his life.
Praise God.
And so when he did finally pass away, my greatest joy was to know that the last quarter of his life
He's in the presence
was,
of God.
yeah, and it was wildly different than
So
the first 3
basically,
quarters.
to close it up for us, we're talking about changing our legacy.
Yeah.
So you decided, once you got married to Lisa, you were going to change your legacy, which we talk about all the time, living
Sure.
and leaving a godly legacy.
Yeah.
So you decided to change the legacy. Give us a brief snapshot of that, and then into your family, and we'll close up with
Sure.
that.
So you remember real quickly, my great-grandmother married 3 times, probably a prostitute. My great-aunt Helen 13 times. My grandmother, I don't know if I mentioned this, she was married and divorced 3 times. One of her husbands was her sister's former husband. So that's, And then my parents are divorced, and then my dad goes off chasing every woman. And I had made a decision. Of course, I was chasing after Jesus. So it was just natural to say, hey, it stops here. This is going to be the first generation of Winters that we don't know divorce in my family. And I am going to be fully committed to Lisa, and I'm going to do whatever I have to do to make this marriage strong. And so I did that. And then as my son was getting older and starting to date, I said to him, Josh, I paid a price to do this, to change our family story and legacy. That is very precious to me, that the story is different now. But there's going to come a day I'm going to hand you that legacy. And my dream and my prayer is that you would carry it on, that you would be a husband who loves his wife and a father who cares for his children, and that the Winters story would be changed with us. Yeah.
Praise
Amen.
God.
Awesome. It definitely has. Pastor, wanted to thank you from the podcast crew here at Legacy Men's Podcast for joining us.
Yeah.
And for also just with your heart, the position that you have in the church and the amount of people that you have coming in and out and all of that are being saved.
Yeah.
I'm glad you didn't become a surgeon.
Yep, me too.
I appreciate that. But my wife and I included,
me
we
too.
were saved here.
Oh, wow.
And, just the messages, the teaching of parenting and being a man and, following Jesus, the way that you're able to just help individuals day in and day out, you are definitely saving lives. So we really appreciate
thank
you
you.
joining us here at the
Yeah,
Legacy Men's
absolutely.
Podcast.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so thank you very much for tuning in again here at the Legacy Men's Podcast, where we learn how to live and leave a godly legacy. Don't forget to subscribe and share this content with your friends and family.
Amen. Pastor, thank you.
We're good?
Thank you.
Okay.
Next time on the Legacy Men's Podcast.
Well, it is very clear to me that we have the Word of God in the Bible. We do have the Word of God. It is so precise and so true. This book will bring you to many parts of the Bible, not the entire Bible, but many, many parts, and some of its most difficult to understand parts as well. And we see that it all makes sense precisely. And that is very comforting and very, very profound. It's taken me to a point whereas my faith has strengthened to the point where the leap from what I know and what I believe is no longer this imposing, intimidating chasm, but rather something I can easily step across. I know that there is a God. It's not that I have to believe so much, is that I know. I have seen this make sense in a way that could not be possible otherwise.
Yeah.
Yeah.